Welcome to tonight's presentation, and thank you for being here. My name is Jessie Jones, and I am the volunteer coordinator for Coastwatch. Coastwatch is a mile-by-mile beach adoption program that introduces volunteers into the world of citizen science, beach stewardship, and much, much more. I am going to introduce Ed Joyce, who is a board member of Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, who is hosting this tonight. Coastwatch is the volunteer arm of the organization, and I will be working behind the scenes with questions for the duration of the evening. And Ed is going to introduce the program, say a couple of words about Oregon Shores, and introduce our speakers. Take it away, Ed.
Good evening and welcome. I'll be tonight's moderator. Tonight's panel discussion is entitled Oregon Offshore Wind Energy, and I think this promises to be a good one. We've assembled 4 speakers who are intimate with this issue, and they should be able to provide a good overview of the issues involved. The format is that each speaker will have 15 minutes to present. That will be followed by 5 minutes of questions. And then at the end, we will all regroup for a roundtable discussion with questions and comments from the audience and the speakers. Most people, I have a feeling, are probably supportive of the development of offshore wind energy, but it has to be done right. And the goal of tonight's event is to present some of the issues that must be addressed before moving forward with establishing wind energy off Oregon's coast. And I want to start right away, and we'll start with our first speaker. Our first speaker is Yelena Nowak, who is the director of the Oregon Trawl Commission. And the title of her talk is Climate Change and the Future of Food Security, the Fishing Industry's Perspective on Offshore Wind Energy Development. Yelena, take it away.
Thank you, Ed. Hi, everyone. It is my pleasure and honor to be here with you today and sharing the perspective from the fishing industry. Thanks for the opportunity. My name is Yelena Nowak. I am the executive director of the Oregon Trawl Commission. I am originally from Central Asian country, Kazakhstan, the largest landlocked country in the world, 10th largest country in the world. And now I am working for the Oregon trawl fishing sector. My education is, I have a master's degree in international management from Portland State University and bachelor degree in economics from Samara State University in Russia. I got acquainted with the fishing industry in my previous role at the Oregon Department of Agriculture when I was covering the Oregon coast and with a role of the trade development manager. So the moment this position opened up, it was an easy move. I really fell in love with the coast, with people, with the industry, and of course with the ocean. Oregon Trawl Commission was established in 1963 to support and promote the interests of back then otter trawl fishing industry, which is now trawl. And our constituents include 3 fisheries, the trawl fleet participating in state-managed Oregon pink shrimp fishery, and 2 federally managed fisheries, West Coast groundfish trawl fishery and Pacific whiting fishery. The fishermen participating in those fisheries use the semi-pelagic trawl gear, catching shrimp, midwater trawl gear for whiting and rockfish, as well as the bottom trawl for other groundfish products. Our fisheries are truly the pride of the West Coast of the United States. Our Oregon pink shrimp fishery was the first wild shrimp fishery that ever achieved the Marine Stewardship Council certification back in 2007. We remain certified, and as a matter of fact, we are entering in a couple of weeks our fourth audit and the third recertification of the fishery, with now adding the California pink shrimp fishery as well. Washington has been certified as well. Groundfish, West Coast groundfish fishery became certified in 2014 with the Marine Stewardship Council, and it was named by the Marine Stewardship Council the most diverse and complex fishery in the world to ever achieve the certification. We still are that fishery. We maintain our status. We currently have 18 individually certified species under the groundfish umbrella. Our trawl fleet, as I said, using 3 gears, delivering, basically, it's not only Oregon boats, it's also the boats fishing out of the ports in Northern California and Southern Washington, but delivering in Oregon. So our constituency is broad and delivering a variety of great, healthy, sustainable local protein sources we're very proud of. A little bit about our sector's contributions. Oregon is the largest share on the West Coast producing those products. We produce most of the shoreside whiting on the West Coast, groundfish, bottom trawl groundfish, and pink shrimp. Oregon trawl fishermen contribute, and I'm going to cover here 1 year, the pre-COVID 2019, as well as for comparison, the 10-year value from 2010 to 2019. In 2019, our Pacific whiting fishery landed 222 million pounds of whiting with a total value of about $22 million. For comparison, the 10-year volume was 1.5 billion pounds and the value approximately 150 million. Groundfish, trawl groundfish was delivered 22 million pounds in 2019 with a value of 13 million, and total 10-year, 258 million pounds with 156 $1 million in value. Midwater rockfish fishery, which is fairly new, it started in 2017 when the regulatory changes allowed the midwater groundfish boats access that resource with a midwater trawl gear. So in 2019, we landed 24 million pounds of midwater rockfish with a value of $6 million, and 10-year volume was 86 million pounds with $24 million. As you can see, because of the short time frame, this fishery has been going full force just since 2017. Therefore, the 10-year contributions are somewhat small, but we anticipate the volume and the value to at least maintain, or certainly value we're working towards improving. Oregon pink shrimp in 2019 landed 27 million pounds with a value of $20 million, and 10-year volume was 403 million pounds with a value of $239 million. I would like to cover the economic contributions for the Oregon fisheries in total. The commercial fisheries in 2019 alone brought $382 million in coast-wide income and approximately $560 million in statewide income in 1 year. Jobs coast-wide, $8,000 jobs, and statewide more than 9,000 jobs. With a total output coast-wide for commercial fisheries, more than $800 million, and for the statewide economy, almost $1.2 billion. That's 1 year. And together with the recreational fisheries and commercial, we are having the statewide income contribution of $700 million, more than 11,000 jobs and $1.5 billion in economic output statewide. As you can tell, this is a very substantial contribution considering our coastal communities are rural and fishing industry dependent. Something that these numbers that I got from ODF&W Economic Contributions Report, most recent, covering 2019, certain elements of the industry are not factored in, such as gear shops, shipyards, and all various other support industries that our industry depends on, and also that contribute economic value to our local communities. As the food producers, and actually one of the major protein producers in the state of Oregon, the other protein production is eggs and cattle. The production of the actual beef is very negligible in Oregon, although it may be changing. That leaves me with, in a climate crisis scenario, we are looking at what is the biggest threat of the climate change to the human population. According to USDA, the chief environmentalist at the USDA stated that the biggest threat of the climate change is food insecurity. While the climatic impacts, such as rising seas, are certainly substantial, they are regional. They will be region-based and incremental, while food insecurity is not something that happens incrementally. And we already had a very sad experience throughout COVID-19 with the vulnerability of the food supply chain and shortages in different parts of the US at the retail stores, which I really hope that are improving right now. But the importance of the wild sustainable fisheries of the Oregon coast for the food security of these and future generations is really hard to overstate. For just a comparison, I would like—
5 minutes, Yelena. Thank you.
Thank you. The population since the 1961, when the astronauts from the US went to the moon, doubled since then. Globally, from 3.7 billion to over 9 billion people. And interestingly, it only increased by 2/3 in the US, while the population of Oregon, Washington, and California individually also have doubled since then. The world population is expected to grow to almost 10 billion by 2050, with so many more mouths to feed, the growing desire in the middle class for meat and dairy in developing countries. Global demand for food could increase by between 59 and 98%. Right now, the food accounts for over a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. Half of the world's habitable land is used for agriculture. 70% of global freshwater withdrawals are used for agriculture. And 78% of global ocean and freshwater pollution is caused by agriculture. With that in mind, the sustainable wild capture fisheries, which we have on the West Coast, some of the best well-managed fisheries in the world. There is a handful of the countries with such a level of exceptional fishery management. We do not take any nutrients. By we, I mean the production of our products. It hardly uses any fresh water. It does not use any arable land, no nutrients, no fertilizers. The impact, the environmental impact of the wild sustainable seafood production is substantially, it's negligible and substantially lower than land-based ag. So what is the concern for the fishing industry with the offshore wind energy? Is a couple of things. Floating deep water technology for offshore wind is largely prototype based. The existing facilities in a couple places around the world are not in the deep waters. The ramifications of employing such technology on the industrial scale are not really well understood. The current offshore wind energy boom in the United States is painfully resembling what this country went through and the rest of the world went through during the fossil fuel boom in the late 20th century. And just, I know I'm running low on time, but I want to highlight quickly just a few of the impacts from the potential impacts that we are very concerned about. And again, I would like to emphasize that the fishing industry is not standing in the way of the development for the renewable energy on the West Coast. By no means. We're not against it. We're not opposed it. All we are asking is compromise. Right now, the compromise is a little bit off the table. And from the degradation of the habitat, the impact to the stocks, from the electromagnetic field, the noise pollution, the actual pollution from the chemicals and the metals that are used in the wind turbines, the anchoring systems, the secondary entanglement, and the primary entanglement with the anchor systems. The impacts are immense. There is the safety implications to the not just fishing fleet, but any fleet, the radar interference, the difficulty for the US Coast Guard to perform the rescue operations. And for our sector, the bottom trawl groundfish fishery is very dependent on the continuous bottom trawl groundfish surveys that have been performed that ensures the health of our stocks and the really exceptional management of our fishery. The currently proposed coal areas are threatening the access to much of the area for the survey grounds. Granted, we understand that the coal areas will become wind energy areas, and will substantially, hopefully, decrease in size. The survey grounds will still be impacted. What is my time? Jess?
You are at about 30 seconds.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, I would like to take my 30 seconds and thank this group and everyone who signed up to come and listen. Climate change is an important, and it certainly is a high risk, high priority issue that the whole world is facing, but doing it right and doing it in a way that not just considers the interests of the local coastal communities, but really does it in a way that supports the communities and the existing industries is critical. And right now, it's sad to say, but this is not the way things are working. The process is not, it's backwards, and the public process is pretty much not existent. And fisheries have a great comparison how the fisheries are managed in the United States. That's one of the reasons our fisheries are some of the best fisheries in the world. It's all collaborative approach. It's the stakeholder engagement, not just engagement, but input that feeds into the management and the decision-making processes. And it's the absolute transparency of what's going on. And some of the success stories that our fisheries have had is thanks to the collaboration and the unity spirit that we have had with the environmental groups, with the fishery managers, scientists, and the industry itself coming together, working together, and finding the solution that really addresses all concerns of the stakeholders. And right now, my concern is the fishing industry is not even considered a stakeholder. We're considered the public. But to finish this on a positive note, I feel there is a tremendous amount of the talent in this group and in other groups related to these discussions, and it's all spotlight is on the problem, and it's an exciting time for making a change. But again, the ocean is very important. It balances our climate. It helps us to maintain the temperature we have. And it also produces, and the I have not touched on upwelling and I won't, but just something to mention, West Coast is one of the 4 places in the world with a California current being some of the most productive upwelling systems in the world, responsible for what we have of our coast. And the risks that offshore wind energy or not careful development of this energy sector may lead are tremendous.
Thank you, Yelena.
Thank you,
Thank you very much. Ed, are
Jesse,
you going to be
Jesse, we need to move on to the next speaker.
Yep, yep. Thank you, Yelena. All right.
Our next speaker is Shannon Souza. Shannon is the Executive Director of the Oregon Coast Energy Alliance, and the title of her talk is Coexistence by Design. Shannon, it's all yours.
Thanks, Ed. I'm going to say hello to everyone. I've been having intermittent video issues and interconnectivity, so if you see me shut off my video, you'll know why. This is a picture of our beautiful South Coast. Yelena, it was good. I hadn't met you before. I know that we've spoken at similar public meetings, but I'll give you a brief description of why I'm here today. I came down to this coast about 27 years ago as a fresh out of engineering school engineer who wanted to work on sustainable solutions that balance our society's needs and protect our beautiful ecosystems that we certainly have out here, and also are able to really, some of those societal needs are to protect our culture, to protect our food stocks, to provide for our energy resources. So that little pocket there covers a lot. So I've been a sustainability consultant down here on the coast for about 27 years, but I'm talking to you as a volunteer. I've been volunteering a heck of a lot in this direction because I do think that we have an opportunity here to balance all of that. So I'm gonna advance forward here. Ocean is a really new nonprofit. It started about 2 years ago when some folks found out that there was a federal agency called BOEM. We didn't even know they existed, and that they were talking about something called floating offshore wind off of our coast. What's that? So we started talking to each other, doing research and sharing what we found out, because there is actually a process and a timeline that had already been established for the leasing of our waters, for the development of offshore wind. And we thought that the coastal communities should know about that, understand what the conflicts might be, understand what the opportunities might be, and instead of reacting to it, lean in and understand it and prepare ourselves for that. We quickly realized, I also serve on Governor Brown's Resilience Mitigation Advisory Council, and I realized that we completely lack infrastructure out on the coast. And we have a lot of resilience issues to take care of. So I think a lot about what happens when the grid goes down, not just the short outages, but the long-term outages, and how we can take care of ourselves. So we quickly advanced into all advanced energy technologies. It doesn't have to just be offshore wind, but how do we take care of ourselves out on the coast and do so in a sustainable way that takes care of our other very, very successful industries that we all cherish and rely on, like our sustainable seafoods. Traditionally, and that's what Yelena was talking about, the BOEM process is following a very traditional project proponent process. Folks get together behind closed doors. Usually it's members of industry or potentially some other electeds who noticed, hey, there's a need, there's a market there. When the financiers find out that there's a market, then they start thinking about what shape is that going to take, how do they get in the game, and they start drawing plans. Typically that happens behind closed doors. For projects like this that we're talking about that are going to impact a lot of folks, by the time they actually get to have a say in some way that would potentially shape the project, it's way down the line. Millions of dollars have been spent. The project is not very pliable, and you end up in conflict and litigation. So we were looking at this opportunity and thinking, gosh, does it have to be like that? And instead of trying to interrupt that process, said, you know, actually, and I'll get into why we're so interested in this technology, but why don't we start talking about this now and leaning in very heavily and advocating for the fishing community to be sitting down at the drawing table and figuring out what would be the ideal places for us, what would this look like for us, for the ecological community to be doing that, for our ports, all of this, while the projects are very pliable, and those that are going to be investing in those projects and building the projects and going for the permits are still at the drawing board. Let's give them the priorities of the community first. It doesn't mean that it's all smooth sailing and perfect, but it is a path of greater acceptance for all of those in whose backyard these projects are going to be built. So our strategy is really to lean in and talk to those folks who are going to be the deepest impacted, make sure that everyone's up to speed, kind of level set on what our options are and what the situation is. And then we turn that into advocacy. We've been very active in very many places, really hit the ground running, and most notably to a lot of folks. And one of the reasons probably that we're here is the bill that we passed unanimously off of Oregon's House floor last year, House Bill 3375. House Bill 3375 established our state planning goal. And it's unique, certainly in the nation, possibly on Earth, in that instead of other legislation that says you need to build this and you need to build it by now because it's all about economic development, that's not what this bill said. It said, this is coming. Why don't we start planning for 3 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2030? And why don't we do that instead of being reactive? Why don't we plan and come up with some plans of our own that benefit the state, maximize the benefits, multiply the benefits, and minimize the conflicts? Why is it 3 by 30? There's several reasons. One of them, this is a map of our transmission lines out here on the coast. We completely rely on imported energy. We do have poorer reliability and power quality than anywhere else within this whole service area. We do have a history of power disruptions that a lot of us don't notice because we're used to it. They are going to increase in frequency and duration. We have low populations. We are some of the last to be served, and we're literally at the end of the line. And all of our ratepayer dollars go outside. We don't have a choice of who we purchase our electricity for. We write a check. And in the case of me and Pacific Power decides what they're going to do with that. What they would like to do is build resources farther inland or keep natural gas in their portfolio. Oregon's system, when I first asked about floating offshore wind, we thought, oh, it's just going to be for San Francisco or it's just for Seattle, and it's not going to happen until we get direct transmission down to there. What we discovered back in 2020 changed all of that, is that actually our grids can support somewhere between 2 and 3 gigawatts of offshore wind. We could actually have a net zero Oregon coast. And it actually frees up more transmission so we can do more renewables in the interior of our state, which we very, very, very much need. So this is just kind of going over some of those points from that Pacific Northwest Laboratory study that I was talking about. Since 2018, I've been engaging on behalf of the solar and storage industry in the Pacific Northwest on all of our energy planning. We are literally rebuilding the grid and resourcing it. Last time we did this was in 1935. So the work that we're doing now, in all likelihood, we need to be planning for the next 100 years, but no need to look out that far. It's very scary. We are in a state of capacity shortfalls. We don't have the electrons as we look around the corner into the next years to meet all of our needs. This is the grid that we live on, whether we want to or not. That's the footprint of the grid that we share our resources with. We refer to it as the WEC, it's the Western Interconnection. The Western Interconnection looks like this. Right now, we've got about 270 gigawatts of clean energy that the Western states can actually use by statute going forward. In the next 6 years, we need another 200. That's pretty staggering. It took us about 36 years to build the first ones. As Yelena said, we've got population, more mouths to feed, more electrons, more cars, more trucks. All of our non-renewable capacity has to be retired. Even though we are really good, the Pacific Northwest leads the nation in energy conservation and will continue to do so and needs to continue to do so. Even so, the demands are huge. See that renewables build? That's Oregon's offshore wind that everyone is planning on, literally banking on. Curtailment occurs when we say, okay, we're taking all of the natural gas out of there, all of the coal. Those are the kind of plants that you flip a switch and the power goes on. So regardless of whether the wind is flowing or the water is flowing and the sun is shining, gosh darn it, we want our electrons when we want them. So you overbuild in that situation, saying that one of these renewables is always going to be able to meet our needs. Sometimes the renewables are producing more than we need in that situation. That's curtailed and there's no value for that. That's where electrolysis and renewable hydrogen come into play.
5 minutes, Shannon.
Thank you. This is where the projections for renewable hydrogen are. Why? Electric vehicles, decarbonization of the transportation sector, all of that requires a lot more electrons. So I've heard it said maybe solar could take care of it. Solar can take care of a lot of it, but it's still a fraction. So maybe we should just roll back our clean energy goals like Montana did. Climate change is very real. We know that. Transportation side, all of these involve energy. So energy is taking about 80% bite of those contributions. And as Yelena said, it's certainly impacting our fishers as well. The Pacific Fisheries Management Council's climate change scenarios, we're looking at some different scenarios going forward. And these are the different impacts that our fishing communities are facing. And we're really interested in looking at ways that we can bring tools over to the West Coast to integrate the needs of the fishing industry with this new emergent technology of offshore wind, which, by the way, has a lot of resources on it. So we're completely in consort there and would very much like to bring more resources to this conversation so we can, Oregon, do the best job that the United States has ever done in this coexistence by design. For example, we are developing hypothetical footprints for different scenarios totaling 3 gigawatts within those proposed call areas. We're suggesting a preliminary cumulative effects assessment of those scenarios leading up to our bids in 2023. We're looking at the East Coast and seeing that we have multi-factor bidding. In North Carolina, they only included domestic supply chain and workforce development, but we can include whatever we want as a state. And we're very interested in getting the fishing industry together with industry from offshore wind and talking about this now instead of being in a reactionary mode. So I think I got all in there. In general, we are just looking for the path forward. Share the frustrations of many from the traditional approach, which is rather closed door, and really are looking for ways that we can advocate together to push up our sleeves, get to the drawing board, and make this work for everyone, which we're confident that we can.
Shannon, thank you. Jesse, I think we have a time for a question, don't we?
Yes, we do. We have a couple of minutes. If anyone would like to ask a question, we actually have one in the queue here from Cindy, who asks, she says, strongest offshore winds are from Coos Bay, Oregon to Northern California. How is this going to affect Oregon coast near shore?
Was that a question for me or?
I think so. I think so.
So near shore, it's where are we bringing the electrons or the hydrogen to shore? You can actually electrolyze at ocean and bring in hydrogen, bring the energy into shore in the form of hydrogen. So where is that going to happen? Is it where there are existing cable routes? So that's part of that. I suppose the near shore other impacts would be in transit during deployment of the array and all of the infrastructure that will need to be installed in the ocean to not just the floating turbines, but all of the tethers and the entire array and all of the transmission system. And then the other impacts would be near those, wherever the ports are that are supporting the industry, and what are they doing to support the industry? Are they actually deploying? I know there's a lot of conversation down at Humboldt Bay. I know that they're definitely looking at Coos Bay. So what role does that port play? Depending on that role that the port is playing, there's obviously going to be more traffic of different kinds of vessels heading in and out of the port. So I think those are the biggies. There have been some visual simulations that were completed by NREL to support California's call area deliberations that they were having. So what the visual impacts, that's what I'm getting at. So they did visual simulations for about 15 miles offshore. I think the closest that our call areas are 13 miles offshore. We heard, I can't remember if it was at PFMC's and BOEM's call a couple weeks ago. There was a request for, when are visual simulations going to be done for our call areas? And they're saying that it won't be done until after the bid. We're asking the question, but why? Maybe NREL could, maybe we could find some funding and NREL could do that now. Same with bringing NOAA Spatial over here so that they can help us get some better data and do a deeper dive and look for fewer conflicts. But I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Shannon. And then we'll save the next question from Cindy and at the end, so we can move on.
Sounds good. Thank you, Shannon. Good job. Okay, our next speaker is Joe Liebezeit. Joe is a staff scientist and Avian Conservation Manager with Portland Audubon. And the title of his talk is Oregon's Productive Marine Ecosystem and Floating Offshore Wind Development, a Cause for Concern or Hope. Take it away, Joe.
All right, thanks, Ed. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Great, awesome. Yeah, Jesse is going to be running the slideshow for me. I had some technical challenges on my side, but I'm coming to you today from Portland, Oregon. And I want to first start out by thanking Oregon Shores, Ed and Jesse, for putting this together and inviting me to speak with this great panel. And please stay for the next panelist, Mike Graybill. He'll finish up before we can really get into questions. My talk, I'm going to be focusing on the importance of Oregon's offshore waters for birds and other wildlife and fish. So I'll dig into that a bit more. And then I'll discuss some of the potential impacts. You've heard about a little bit about them from Yelena. And then finally, I'll offer some recommendations to improve the process and to try to minimize impacts to wildlife as much with this incoming offshore wind development that we're talking about today. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about Portland Audubon. Why don't you go to the next slide, Jesse? So Portland Audubon is, I think, the oldest conservation organization in Oregon. We were founded back in 1902. And you can see in the photo here on the right is our founder, William Finley, who there's actually a wildlife refuge named after him in the Willamette Valley. Him and Henry Bowman are scaling up 3 Arch Rock back in 1902 or something. And you can see that's the way they worked back then without any ropes and trying to climb up and scare those common murres. Of course, we wouldn't want to do that nowadays. But their subsequent lobbying to the Teddy Roosevelt administration led to protection of 3 Arch Rock, as well as some of the other iconic places in Oregon like Klamath and Malheur. And our mission is to protect wildlife and habitats statewide. And another key part of our mission is to connect people with nature. So we have a pretty extensive education program. Go ahead to the next slide. Our marine conservation priorities range from things like seabird protection. A lot of it is focused on the marbler mullet, which you can see down in the picture. rocky habitat protection, marine reserves, eelgrass and estuaries, and of course, offshore wind, the topic of tonight. I want to take this moment just to say that our position, Audubon's position on offshore wind is that I think like everybody here, we're supportive of it. We need to move away from fossil fuels, but we want it to be done in a process that is transparent and minimizes, in our case, we advocate for the protection of wildlife and their habitats. So we want that, obviously we want those to be, impacts to those species to be minimized. In this picture here, you can see a couple of our community scientists at Hesida Head doing some seabird monitoring. Go ahead to the next slide, Jesse. So Yelena touched on this a bit, but we were talking about the upwelling in the California current ecosystem, which is what drives so much of the productivity on the West Coast. And there's actually was supposed to be a little graphic on the other part of the slide here, but I don't know why it didn't show up. But anyway, it showed how cold, nutrient-rich water in the lower levels of the ocean moves its way up and circulates and creates this amazing productive system for all kinds of, from fish to birds to marine mammals. And we really live in a special place because you can see, as you can see in this graphic, that the California coast ecosystem is one of only 4 places that are called the Eastern Ocean Boundary Upwelling Zones on Earth, where we have this incredible productivity caused by this kind of upwelling system. And so really, you know, Yelena talked about how it's the offshore floating wind is such a new technology and it has really not been tested. And so that is a major concern, and it is coming into one of the most productive places in the world. Go ahead, next slide. Oh, there it is. It was hiding on me. Okay, next slide. So now I'll jump into a bit of importance for the wildlife. So of course, at Audubon, we do a lot of work with seabirds. And Oregon is a very important place for nesting, colonial nesting seabirds in particular. Fish and Wildlife estimates 1.3 million nesting seabirds on the Oregon coast. That's more than half of all nesting seabirds across the entire West Coast from Washington down to California. And I know a lot of you folks joining today that live on the coast are well aware of this. In the summer times, you can see really amazing colonies of like common murre, which this picture was taken by OSU, I think, at Yaquina. A total of 15 colonial nesting species nest in Oregon, and also marbled murrelets, which, as some of you know, nest a bit inland in trees. And yeah, go ahead to the next slide. So a lot of those birds I just talked about, the colonial nesting seabirds, they nest nest in Oregon, and a lot of their time is spent in nearshore waters of Oregon. So they wouldn't necessarily in all of their life cycle be impacted by floating offshore wind, which is considerably further offshore. But there are some of those species we just don't know a lot about, like their wintering distribution. And some of them could definitely come into impact with offshore wind. So, but there's a whole nother group of seabirds that don't come to Oregon to nest, but they come here to eat. And they come literally from all over the Pacific Basin. You can see in this little schematic here, I don't want you to go ahead and read the fine print. This is actually a poster we show at some of our events, but you can just see the lines going from, the arrows going from birds. So for example, the flesh-footed shearwater, which nests off of Australia, will come to the waters off of Oregon to forage during the productive periods of year. The critically endangered short-tailed albatross, which you can see in the picture here, they nest in colonies on islands off of Japan, and their population is, you know, only a couple thousand individuals, and they are regularly seen off the Oregon coast foraging. So as you can get a sense that this incredibly productive place in the world literally attracts birds from all over the world. Go ahead to the next slide. So if you make a list of all the birds that could potentially be impacted by offshore wind in Oregon, it's a pretty big list. And again, some of these birds are more near shore and maybe won't interact as much, but there's still unknown about a lot of that. But there's about, I think, 70 plus species. And this map here shows some of the important bird areas that have been identified by Audubon and BirdLife International as hotspots. And I'll talk more about wildlife hotspots as we go along. Go ahead to the next slide. So seabirds as a group of birds are one of the most challenged groups of birds, and are in decline across the board. for many of the species. And I just cite a couple studies here. A study from 2012 by Croxall et al. Estimated that 28% of the 374 seabird species globally are threatened. And then this other study down here from 2015, and this graph shows the trend from that study is that globally, seabird populations, when you take all seabird species together, they've declined about 70% between 1950 and 2010. And that cause of decline is from a number of factors ranging from climate change to poor management of fishing stocks, to plastic pollution, things like that. But anyway, the point here is that seabirds are struggling, and we really need to be careful about impacts to them from anything. Go ahead, next slide. Of course, I focused a lot on birds because I'm an Audubon person, but of course, other wildlife and fish are could be impacted by offshore wind. And a few here are Pacific gray whales. We enjoy that migration along the Oregon coast, and we also have a resident population in Oregon of gray whale. The orcas, and specifically the southern killer whale population, is an endangered species. You can see here in the image, and also things like the leatherback turtle have critical habitats off of Oregon. Go ahead to the next slide. So a bunch of Audubon and a bunch of other conservation groups, including Oregon Shores, submitted a comment to Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, again, also called BOEM, which is the agency that Shannon mentioned that's leading this whole process, back in October. And we knew that they were coming up to draw these, what they call the call areas, or those areas where developers would be allowed to go into and develop and pitch leases for development. And so we wanted to kind of get ahead of that and provide our recommendations to BOEM on areas that they should, stay out of because they're ecological hotspots. And so in these two maps here, on the left side, we have a map kind of depicting the important bird areas, important areas for fish, which are kind of in the red, the habitat areas of particular concern, which are like rocky reef habitat, also essential fish habitats, and also cetacean feeding grounds, which you can see in the kind of the yellow shading. And on the right side, we kind of, it just got really busy, so we had to split the maps apart to show a lot of the important wildlife areas. And on the right side, you can see the southern resident killer whale critical habitat, which is the green, which you can see spans a lot of the offshore wind planning area, leatherback turtle critical habitat, and humpback whale critical habitat. And especially when you look at that left map, you can really see some hotspots, ecological hotspots, pop out at you. You can see around Hasita Bank, Stonewall Bank, really productive area. I know it's very productive for birds and marine mammals, and also for the fisheries. Down at Cape Blanco, we also have a really important hotspot down there. I'll go ahead to the next slide, Jesse. So I just want to, I know that some of these have been talked already. The first presentation, some of the concerns about potential threats to wildlife, fish, and habitat. So I think first of all it's just the siting of where development will happen, is that we want to keep them out of the ecological hotspots. I think I made that point in the last slide. And also I made this point already, as with Yelena in the first presentation, is just floating offshore wind, which you can see the schematic of here in this slide, is an untested technology. For birds, their collisions with the infrastructure of offshore wind is a concern, as it is on land-based wind facilities. Also displacement and avoidance. So displacement is just that, when you put these structures in, will birds and other wildlife evade or avoid these areas? Entanglement is an issue that not only for fishing gear, but also for whales, marine mammals. So that's a concern. And then cumulative impacts, which I think Shannon mentioned, and it's a big concern for us. For example, the whales are migrating along these routes along the whole West Coast, and we have these different call areas. How are those different call areas cumulatively impacting a species like the gray whale, for example? Okay, go to the next slide. So I pull these same maps up again, but this time threw in the call areas, which are those those three blue outlined polygons you can see in the southern part of Oregon, those are the areas that BOEM decided to delineate as the first draft of their call areas, or the areas that developers can go in to nominate lease or to ask for leases for development. So immediately we're concerned about this because these are really big areas. I mean, if you see those three areas, they basically kind of half of the Oregon planning area. It's 2,000 square miles, which is a massive area. There's significant rocky reef habitat still within those call areas, which is very important, not just for wildlife, but again, for fish and for the fishing industry. And again, it's crossing major migration routes. You can see on the right side, the humpback critical habitat and the leatherback critical habitat are well within those call areas. So again, we are still concerned about these areas. One positive thing is that BOEM did decide to stay out of the Heceta Stonewall Bank area, which we're really happy about, and also around Cape Blanco. So we're happy at least about that, but there's still more work that needs to be done to minimize wildlife impacts. Go ahead to the next slide. This is just zooming into the call areas a bit more, and you can just see, for example, in the middle call area, I think that's called the maybe the Coos Bay call area, no, the Bandon call area. You can see, maybe Jesse, you can with your cursor, because I can't, where it says Cape Blanco, you can see that red, like that red area a little bit to the left. Yeah, right there. That is a big rocky reef habitat, really important for fisheries and for birds and for mammals. That's in that call area. We don't want that. Okay, go to the next slide. So here are, I'm getting close to the end of my presentation here, but this is an important slide because these are some of the recommendations we have specifically targeting the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and other entities involved in this process. And you can see the BOEM process up in the slide here, and I won't go through it in detail, just to say that we're in the earlier part of the process, and it's a long process, and they do indicate there's public engagement at various points along it. But the thing that we are concerned about in terms of the process recommendation is that BOEM decides where they're going to put these call areas, and they don't give you a lot of information on how they're going to make those decisions. And then they allow the environmental impact statement or environmental impact assessments to happen. And we think that's kind of backwards. We really feel like there needs to be a programmatic environmental impact assessment or a least conflicts analysis, like Shannon mentioned, and I'd love to hear more from her on that. But if you were at the last Oregon Task Force meeting on renewable energy, when the call areas were put out there to the public, there was kind of unanimous support amongst the conservation groups and the fishing industry that we really need to do this programmatic EIS. And what that would do is, again, it would allow more transparency and allow the public and others to really have more say to the BOEM before they put these call areas down or where they should be. The other really important part is it would now allow a cumulative assessment. So if you look at that map on the right side, you can see, I just put as an example, all the call areas on the West Coast so far. There's the 3 we have in Oregon, and you can see there's 3 down in California. And I also put in the humpback whale critical habitat, which ranges across that whole area. So how is a humpback whale going to be impacted in all 3 of those call areas potentially? There's no way that BOEM can assess that right now, because the way they have this process set up is that an EIS is done in each call area after the call areas are already established. There needs to be a way to cumulatively assess all the call areas on wildlife, and that is something we're pushing on to BOEM to do. We also feel like there needs to be a technical science advisory working group as part of this process. Right now, BOEM scientists, and they have some really good scientists, and their bird guy is really good, but there needs to be an independent technical science group that helps with decisions about call areas and throughout the whole process, because there's going to be adaptive management needed during this process as installations are put in and so forth, and decommissioning as well. And there are examples of technical science advisory working groups. In the state of Maine, they have a subcommittee under their technical advisory committee called the Environmental and Wildlife Work Group or Team. And it includes government agencies, academias, and NGOs. And they try to avoid the highest conflict areas. We have nothing like that in Oregon right now. BOEM presented their call areas to the Oregon Task Force, the Renewable Energies Task Force, which is all decision makers, which is important. Decision makers obviously need to hear about it, but we also need an independent group of scientists to make their assessment as well. There's also examples in New York of in environmental technical working groups as part of their offshore wind processes. And another process recommendation is compensatory mitigation, which I'm sorry, I'm past time. I got to wrap up here. I'm just going to say for site recommendations, if we still have to work with these call areas in the end, we want to know more information on how these call areas are decided, how BOEM is delineating them. We also want to keep all the rocky reefs out of the call areas. And we heard the governor's office of Oregon, Amira Streeter, say that at the last task force meeting. And we also want to look at the seabird hotspots in the call areas. BOEM has not really done that yet. Go ahead to the next slide, Jesse. So, go back one slide. I'm just going to end real quick here. There was a recent study that came out a few months ago that has some of the best information on seabirds off the coast, and we are. And if BOEM is not going to do it, or they're trying to do it right now, we're going to do it as well, and we're using that information to come up with an analysis to overlay all the important bird areas for those species that you can see here, some of which are of conservation concern, and come up with our own assessment of how the call areas should be whittled back based on what we find. So that's it. And just the last slide is just all the different groups that signed on to our October letter to BOEM and are still working with us on this process to try to make a process that is going to be better in the end for everyone. So that's it for me. Sorry I went over.
Very good. Thanks, Joe. Jesse, we should just move on to our final speaker. We went quite a bit over there.
Yeah, let's move on to our next speaker. There's still time for questions at the end.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, anyone that has questions, we'll have plenty of time at the end. Our final speaker is Mike Graybill. Mike is a retired director of the South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. And the title of his talk is, "We Have to Shake Our Fossil Fuel Energy Habit. Is Floating Offshore Wind in Oregon the Best Solution?" Mike.
Unmute.
Okay, we can hear you now, Mike.
Okay, so my name is Mike Graybill. I live in Coos Bay, and I've lived here since the prior century, since the late mid-1970s. My presentation today, let me just see if I can get it going here. Okay, how do I get this? All right, my presentation today is going to walk you through and remind you that floating offshore wind, can you see my cursor?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, floating offshore wind is one type of renewable energy, but that's going to be the focus of this discussion. There are other types of wind energy, and there are other types of renewable energy that should be considered in the mix as we chase away from fossil fuels. Further, this is going to drill in on the Oregon offshore wind discussion. Clearly, the offshore wind discussion also takes place throughout planet Earth. And then we'll move, but the primary focus of my discussion is just to give people in this group that are participating here today an understanding of what is actually physically involved and what might come from that. So the part that I won't be able to get to is how to compare the types of renewable energy from one to the other. As we move away from fossil energy, will be reserved for another discussion. but hopefully you will understand what offshore wind, floating offshore wind involves, so you can make your own comparisons. It's been mentioned earlier, but there's two processes that are driving this discussion. The legislation at the state level that's required the Department of Energy to look at 3 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, as well as the presidential executive order that is 30 gigawatts of offshore wind in America by 2030. It's mentioned earlier that this process is being run at the federal level by this Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. The sole mission of that agency is to issue leases in federal waters of the outer continental shelf. Some of you who have been around for a while may recognize the term Minerals Management Service. That's the former name of this agency before the Deepwater Horizon oil spill revealed management problems with the agency. There's the call areas. They're 2,000 square miles. The target is for BOEM in the first quarter of 2024 to issue leases within these call areas to produce 3 gigawatts of electricity. So I think it's important to say, how much is 3 gigawatts? As a primer for people who might be conservation oriented but not engineering oriented, a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, and a megawatt is 1,000,000 kilowatt. Well, it's 1,000 kilowatts, but a gigawatt is 1,000,000 kilowatts. So 3 gigawatts, for example, is 3,000 megawatts. Turbines, wind turbines produce somewhere between 2 and 15 megawatts apiece. So they put them together in wind farms, and wind farms have hundreds of turbines that produce anywhere from hundreds of megawatts of power to gigawatts of power. Just for example, the Bonneville Dam produces 1.2 gigawatts. So we're talking about 3 times the size amount of electricity as the Bonneville Dam. We should hopefully know by now that a wind turbine is an electrical generator that's attached to a propeller. The wind turns the propeller and electricity is produced. Right now, there's over 70,000 wind turbines operating in the United States. Almost all of them are on land, but the turbines that are being developed for offshore are big and getting bigger. So, for example, these turbines weigh hundreds of tons apiece. So I'm going to walk you through the different types of wind energy. There's 2 kinds of bottom-mounted wind energy. One is onshore and the other one is offshore. This is where the towers of the wind turbines are attached to the ground. Right now, there's over 1,000 wind farms in the United States. This is an example of one. I think when people think of wind energy, hopefully all Oregonians have been up the Columbia Gorge and have seen all those big wind turbines. Those are small turbines, about 2 megawatts each. They've been around for a while, and a 450 megawatt facility takes about 39 square miles to generate that power. The next kind of offshore wind is bottom-mounted offshore wind. So it's, in large measure, it's the same as onshore wind. The turbines tend to be bigger. These are 5 megawatts, so they're twice as big as those ones in the Columbia Gorge. And they need more complicated foundations. And this one is one of the German offshore winds. They're in shallow water that's 100 feet deep or 40 meters deep, much shallower than the wind call areas in Oregon. And they involve very elaborate steel structures. And this is an example of one that has just this facility that generates 350 megawatts of power. So that is much smaller than the 3 gigawatts of power that we're discussing. So now we'll move to floating offshore wind. Now the foundation is no longer attached to the bottom. So you have a floating foundation that then has to be anchored or attached to the bottom by mooring lines. And then the electric power lines that come off of the turbines move within the array of turbines to a floating substation where it's conditioned and put into a central cable that is the export cable that goes to the onshore area where it is conditioned again and sent to the grid. Floating offshore wind is a completely new and still prototype scale operation. The earliest history only dates to like 2009. Right now, in contrast to there being over 1,000 onshore wind turbines, there's now turbine farms. There's now only 16 projects as of 2019. So here's what one looks like. There's the tower, the nacelle with the generator in it, the blades. But here's the example of the foundation that is most commonly used, called a semi-submersible foundation. So I'll walk you through the parts of these components. Here's what one of the generators looks like for a commonly produced offshore wind turbine. It produces 12 megawatts of power, and by the time you put blades on it and set it on top of the tower, it weighs nearly 2,000 tons. But that's just for a single tower. You would need 250 of these units, these 12 megawatt units, to produce 3 gigawatts of power. So you can take these things out there, but you have to mount them on a foundation. The tower and the propellers or the blades and the generator are the thing that generate the power. All the rest of this stuff is called the balance of the system. That's the floating structures, the mooring systems to hold the floating structures in place, the cables that connect the turbines to the substation itself, and then the cable that goes to land. So we'll go through piece by piece. Here's what one of the floating foundations looks like for the Windfloat Atlantic project off the coast of Portugal. There's 3 turbines there, and they have 8.4 megawatt turbines on them. They're currently, the one I showed you before was 12, and each one of these platforms is anchored with 3 catenary anchoring systems. Here's Windfloat 1 being towed out to sea, and you can kind of see the scale of what's involved. Here's what the mooring system looks like for a single tower or a single turbine. You have a mooring line that goes and attaches to a chain that then attaches to an anchor. Mooring lines are at least 4 times longer than the depth of the water. And here's an illustration that shows what one of the mooring lines looked like. So I did a quick calculation. Here's an example here where it shows, this reference shows that the length of the mooring line should be between 4 and 8 times the water depth. I did a calculation for 650 meters of water, which is a typical depth in these call areas, and did it a mooring cable length 3 times the length, and then did 3 mooring cables and anchors per turbine assembly, because there's 3 lines on each one of the foundations, times 215 megawatt turbine assembles. That means that a 3 gigawatt wind farm off the Oregon coast will need 600 anchors attached to 727 miles of line.
Okay, and Mike, 5 minutes.
Yep, here's what one of those 600 anchors would look like. Here's the ship that's required to deploy those anchors. Here's what the rope looks like that is attached to the chain. Again, we'll need 600 miles or 700 miles of rope. 600 of these rope systems will be hanging between the towers and the ocean bottom. Once the tower's in place, there's an electrical cable that comes from it in what is called an inter-array cable. That's copper, and it's the cable that carries the electricity. The copper line is not strong enough, so they have to put flotation on the inter-array cables so that they can compensate for the movement of the towers. Here's what an array looks like for 50 turbines. And this is the setup for the inter-array cabling for the electrical cables that go through there. Of course, a 3 gigawatt array would need 200 turbines. This is the array for 50 turbines. So you would be looking at 4 times more than that. The cabling in the array amounts to hundreds of miles. Here's what the ship looks like that is deploying cable in the Dogger Bank. There's how much cable they used for this one off the coast of the east coast of England. That's a 1.3 gigawatt facility. They use 155 miles of cable. They're in shallow water at 30 meters. We're in 100 or 600 meters, so you're going to need more cable to get from top to bottom. So it's easy to say that there would be 350 miles of conducting cable within the array to connect to the substation. I couldn't find a good picture of a floating substation because there aren't that many of them. But this is an example of a substation that's in a wind farm off of Germany. This particular wind substation weighs 8,500 tons. It was earlier mentioned, what would the coastal impacts be? Ports are going to be necessary to build and support and launch these things. There's a whole list of activities that ports must accomplish, or that would be port-related activities. Here's an example of what one of the marshaling and fabrication facilities look like, but not all ports have the same capabilities. So there's examples where some ports would just be involved once the turbine assembly is operational. There's some ports that may have the capability of actually fabricating the components, building those giant generators, fabricating the towers. There's others that might be able to take those components and put them together. They require 5,000-ton cranes to lift these 850-ton generators on top of the towers. So those are some examples of port requirements. And here's an example of just what one port looks like that is assembling the floating foundations. Out here in the distance, you can see the floating, the individual legs of a 3-legged floating foundation. So I just thought that that would give you a sense of what's physically involved in the process, and I'll leave it there. And I'll leave a discussion of comparing it to other wind forms for another time.
Mike, thank you. That was excellent. We can open it up to questions now. Jesse, do you want to help with that?
Yes, absolutely. Let's see.
Jesse, you're going to have to start my video.
Okay. Get back. Yeah. Oops. Okay, just a second here. So everyone can put their video back on. I think I have to ask you to do that.
Mine says I can't start it because the
There you
host
go.
stopped. Okay, there we go.
There you go. Okay. All right. Let's see. We just have a lot of thank yous in the chat, and I'm seeing a lot of comments. And I'm going to actually look for some more questions as well, but I was wondering if any of the panelists have any questions for each other. I know that Joe, you had mentioned that, and I would love to see some of that while I look for some other questions.
Sure. I can ask Shannon. I think what I was asking in my presentation was about a least conflict analysis to do a cumulative assessment. You know, I was talking about the programmatic EIS would be a way that has been done before, even by BOEM, I think, for oil and gas development. They haven't used it for offshore wind as far as I know, or they did do one from 2007, which is a really broad one that was for like the whole, every like the Gulf Coast, East Coast, and that wouldn't be sufficient for what's going on now, I don't think, but they would have to redo it for just the West Coast, I would think. But yeah, Shannon, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that, because I don't know realistically if BOEM is going to go and do a programmatic EAS. There's concern that if we do a programmatic EAS, it would slow things down, and maybe that's true, but from my understanding is 2030 is when that bill says that infrastructure should start being in place for generation of power, and it seems like we have time for a year or so to do a programmatic EIS, but yeah, go ahead, Shannon. Sorry, I put a lot in there.
No, that's all right. I guess we were looking at the scope of the programmatic EIS, and while they are of value, the resolution is pretty poor. So we were looking ahead. We've been talking to some colleagues in the UK. There, the government hired a company called Exodus Group to put the fishing community and the industry together to really do that, to facilitate that conversation. And you could overlay also the conservation groups to do that. Okay, now we have these proposed call areas, which are very amply sized. And that, Ocean wasn't the only one asking for very large draft call areas. But we were certainly one of them. And the reason being, we wanted to have that flexibility between now and the bid to get everyone together to do that process. Where are the absolute areas of least conflict? And that's where we got pretty excited about the spatial toolbox that NOAA has, not NIMS, but a whole different section of NOAA to help us to facilitate that. It doesn't need to be me. Really all Ocean's trying to do is get the funding and the support to do that work and step back and have the Audubons and the fisheries sit down with industry, PFMC, sit down with the industry in those draft call areas and just come up with could we put together a couple of different scenarios? What are some different scenarios for where the 3 gigawatts might be? Getting to Mike Graybill's point, one of the reasons that a PEIS, it's nice, but it doesn't get into the nuts and bolts. If we don't know what the substrate is like, we actually don't know what that anchor looks like. And you're looking at one design for a very small array and talking about 4 acres per turbine, but there are other considerations for not having all of those anchors per turbine, but to have them interconnected. So to give us time to get to the table, come up with some of those scenarios collaboratively, and then run them through analyses. That same spatial tool team that NOAA has, that's been active in the Gulf of Mexico, can do entanglement scenarios and modeling. A lot higher resolution of what it is that we're talking about, so we can look at these options consciously and lean in that way. The other element I wanted to say, I've heard several people say that floating offshore wind is not a technology that's been tested, and that's not true. It is active. It has the high wind Scotland offshore wind array, in fact, went through hurricanes, and Scotland now has another 25 gigawatts out. Ireland just put out a 10 gigawatt RFP off of their coasts. So it's functional, it's coming online. And the other benefit to us in being at 2030 is that while all of these other developments are going on, we can continue to learn about them and get a higher resolution of what to anticipate out on the Pacific coast. And what do we want it to look like by the time that rolls around?
Thank you. We have a question from Dana, who wanted to know more about decommissioning. I don't remember what slide that was on.
Oh,
Okay,
go ahead,
thanks,
Mike.
Mike. Great, thank you.
Yeah, decommissioning is just what happens when the facility is no longer in use. If a turbine wears out or it's going to be removed, you have to take it away from the seabed. So if there's an anchor that's embedded 10 meters in the ocean bottom and you don't need that anchor anymore, do you leave the anchor there or do you remove the anchor? If there's cabling that runs ashore for an array that no longer uses that cable, do you remove that cable or do you leave that cable there? Because there can be disturbance associated with its removal. There's a reasonable discussion of decommissioning as a component of offshore wind energy operation. That is it's just to say, when you're done with this stuff and it's time to take it away, how do you go about doing that?
Thank you. Question here in the Q&A, what kind of port would Coos Bay be with regard to wind turbine construction?
The answer to that is it depends on who you talk to. There are some very optimistic people in the Port of Coos Bay who would like to consider this one of the cluster ports that could do everything. There are other people who are looking more pragmatically at some of the navigation constraints, the shoreside constraints, the crane height constraints associated with the airport. So that is still to be determined. But many of the wind farms that are being developed have components that are manufactured in Spain that are delivered to Scotland. So they don't all have to be built in the port that adjoins the location of the wind turbine assembly. Certainly the Port of Coos Bay qualifies to be one of the ports that could provide operations and maintenance support once the wind turbine array is developed, should one be developed. And in all likelihood, it will be able to do some component manufacture and assembly. It may not be able to do all of that. If it were to be able to do all of the component assembly, there would need to be very substantial improvements made to the port facilities.
Thanks, Mike. Question about birds. How do scientists estimate seabird take when birds that collide with wind turbines would just fall into the ocean? For you, Joe?
Yeah, that's a challenge, I think. And of course, on land, you can have someone go and walk at the base of these wind turbines and, collect all the dead birds and coming up in an assessment. In the ocean, you can't do that. So I know that they've experimented with cameras to sample for strikes. There might be some other technologies out there, but I know that's something that's being tested. But again, because this, I know that Shannon mentioned that it is a tested technology, which is true, but not really in a place like off of Oregon, where there's, significant bird population issues, which I talked about in my presentation. There still needs to be work done to research to be done to figure out the methodology before we'll know how we can really do that in an effective way. So it's a tricky one.
It's a good segue then for the next question, which is there support for an opportunity to do a test or pilot project first instead of full build out of a wind farm on some of the best fishing habitat and rocky reef areas? Who wants to take that one? I know there's a project. I think there's something happening on the coast already here. So, but I don't know a lot about it.
The Wave Lab, maybe?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. That's. I know it's another BOEM project. So there's nothing now, right? No plans to test anything per se in terms of wind energy.
Not that I have heard, if that was directed to me.
It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but yeah, go ahead and if you want to speak to that, Shannon.
In 2013, Principal Power made an attempt to deploy one of their wind turbine assemblies off the coast. I don't think, Shannon, you can clarify, but I don't think they ever actually deployed it. I think they ran into financing difficulty before they did it. But there was an area off of Reedsport that was proposed as a site, which I think that proposal by that company was what actually stimulated or served as an initial stimulus for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to consider developing lease areas.
I don't know what the stimulus was for BOEM to look at more closely, but once they got a look, I think probably it had more to do with NREL looking at our energy crisis. And you're right, that was proposed off of Reedsport. It was closer into shore. It was fixed bottom. And I think that it's an interesting concept to contemplate how can we balance the scalability, like, you know, make it pencil to build and also bake in some adaptive management. You know, what if there's a way for us as a state to contemplate an approach that does just that, you know, says, okay, yes, there's some certainty. Eventually, you know, there's that 3 gigawatts, but we're going to do it in phases. Like I said, everything is on the table, and that's why we're glad that we're having discussions like this. I apologize. I didn't thank anyone. I just jumped in and started my presentation. So apologies for my rudeness, and I am thankful to be here and that you put this all together tonight. It's really great to hear these ideas.
I would say that 3 gigawatts from BOEM's perspective would be considered a pilot. They've identified 17 gigawatts of potential in these call areas. And I haven't seen a wind turbine, a commercial scale, utility scale wind turbine farm that didn't go through phased development. So we have Dogger Bank 1, 2, and 3. But the scale of the phased development is measured in gigawatts these days, or gigawatts, however it's said. So I think really that we should consider this initial, the 3 gigawatt threshold was just set to match the existing grid. It wasn't set because of the amount of wind that occurs offshore. So I think as we contemplate 3 gigawatts of power off the Oregon coast, we should be aware that there's far more wind than that out there. And if it does pencil and someone goes to the expense of laying a 30-mile long conductor cable along the ocean bottom, they're going to want to hook as many wind turbines to it as possible, because that's where the economy of scale comes. These things are scalable, but there's a minimum threshold size that Shannon has identified. But the power of the scalability is in the make it bigger direction, not make it smaller direction. The economies come from from making it as much power as possible. That's why turbines are getting bigger. Turbines are getting bigger because you need fewer of them, so you need fewer foundations, but they're also getting bigger because they capture wind more efficiently.
Folks, it is 7:30 and we have to bring this to a close. I want to thank everybody. That was excellent. Everybody did a wonderful job. And for all of our audience, thank you very much for tuning in, and stay tuned, because there will be a number 2 offshore wind panel discussion coming up in the not too far future. Thanks again, everybody.